Welcome back to Q&A Modeling Bootcamp. Last time, I gave you a sense of the kinds of things that Q&A is capable of understanding without much effort on your part, but also the sorts of things that can go wrong if you simply import your data and do not optimize your model. This time, I'm going to show you some of those things that you can do for optimization. In particular, model shaping. Model shaping is the process of altering the structure of the tables and columns in your model to align with how your users think about that data in the real world. Each thing that the user talks about should map to one table or one column in your database. Those tables and columns should be named what your users would naturally refer to them as, and the objects should be related to each other in ways that the users understand. Frequently, the underlying database is optimized for the needs of the transactional system or the reporting system, not optimized for the needs of the users trying to directly consume that data. There are a couple of alternatives you can use for reshaping your database. First, you can transform your data during import from the data source, using the query language of that source. Second, you can perform rich post-import transformations and add simple calculations in Power Query. Finally, you can add calculated columns and measures directly to the model via the DAX expression language. The first bit of model shaping you're going to need applies to nearly every data source, renaming tables and columns to align them with what end users expect them to be called. So take this database for example. We have a cust info table, a receipts table, and a product list table. And most of those column names are not exactly user-friendly. So renaming those tables to be something more like customer, order, and product, along with more understandable column names, would go a long way toward making Q&A be able to understand these tables better. The second thing you may need to do is add missing relationships. While import from some data sources will automatically import relationships, in others, the relationships are not present in the metadata of the source database. In those cases, Power BI Desktop may be able to detect some relationships automatically, but some you will need to manually create yourself so that Q&A and the rest of Power BI can understand how those tables are related to one another. Remember that rule I mentioned earlier about there needing to be a one-to-one relationship between a thing the user talks about in the real world and a single object in the model? I'll now show you 4 typical examples of how imported tables can violate that rule. First is multi-column entities. Take this table for example. It is a suppliers table that contains a bunch of columns about contacts. Now, if the user wants to talk about contact as a thing, wanting to see all of those columns returned when they discuss contacts, this is not the table structure you'll want to have in your model. Instead, you want to have something that looks more like this, where there's a set of supplier information in the suppliers table and a set of contact information in the contacts table, and a relationship between suppliers and contacts. The second example is property bags. In this table, there's a customer ID, a property column, and a value column. This is a fairly typical property bag, where you have interesting information about each customer broken down row by row. Unfortunately, that makes it so that Q&A cannot answer large classes of interesting questions about those properties, such as what is the average age of customers in each city, since there's no age column to aggregate and no city column to group by. A better structure would look something like this, with distinct columns for each property. The third example is formatted data. If you have a column of data that has internal structure, such as full address, where the street address, city, and country are embedded within the data, Q&A will be unable to extract those individual columns for query separately. So if your users want to ask which customers live in London, you'll need to have a city column as well. When you break the data out into multiple independent columns, keep the full address, because your users may also want to be able to ask questions like, show the full address of E. Rigby. The fourth example is multi-value columns, where multiple values are packed into a single column, not each with a different meaning, but multiple instances, all of which correspond to the same type of thing. In this example, each of these songs has multiple composers. Power BI won't be able to treat these as multiple instances unless you split out your column into a structure that looks more like this, with a table of songs and separately a table of composers, with a relationship back to the songs. The next bit of model shaping you may need to do involves inactive relationships. Power BI currently requires that there be only one active path between any two tables. So if you have, for example, a flights table which has a departure airport ID and an arrival airport ID, only one of those two relationships may be active. Since Power BI and Q&A do not yet support inactive relationships, for now you'll need to either duplicate the remote table or denormalize it into the main table. For example, in this case, you would pull in a departure airport name column and an arrival airport name column. The last two examples of model shaping relate to calculations you'll typically want to add to your model, even if you have well-structured source tables. First, date parts. Consider this orders table with a date column in it. Questions like count orders by year will work because Power BI Desktop adds an automatic date hierarchy for each date column. However, if you want to ask a question like count orders by order year, if for example there's more than one date associated with each order, you'll need to add the date part columns to the model yourself so you can control the column names. Note that if you add a textual month column, you should also add a month number column so that you can get your months to sort correctly. Finally, measures. You'll probably want to add a measure corresponding to any numeric column that acts like a measure. For example, if you ask cost for 2015, that would normally be interpreted by Q&A as a request for a list of orders for 2015 and their associated costs, because we don't necessarily know that cost is acting as a measure rather than just a numeric property. When you create those simple measure columns, you'll want to hide the original column. Otherwise, you'll introduce unnecessary ambiguity. In this case, you'd have two things called cost. One other note about measures. Make sure to define the measures inside of the fact table, the table where they're natively defined, rather than homing them somewhere else. So for example, if you're defining a discount, which is the sum of the price of the product times the discount in that order, that measure should be defined in the line items table, not up in the product table, since discounts are related to anything reachable from the line items table, such as orders and products and customers. It might be tempting to take all of your measures and put them into a single measure table to make them easy to find. Don't do that. It will confuse both your users and Q&A about which measures are meaningful in which contexts. For example, if you have both an employer rating and a product rating measure, Q&A wouldn't know which one to use to answer which employee has the highest rating, if they're both sitting in some random table rather than homed where they're naturally defined. For our second exercise, we're going to start with the model we built in exercise 1. We'll rename poorly named columns and tables, find a multi-column entity and pull that out into a separate table, pivot a property bag, find a formatted column and split it out, take a date column and build the corresponding date part columns, add any missing relationships, and fix any incorrectly guessed relationships. We'll then go through our saved questions list and see what now works, and add to that list. This is a key part of the iterative process. Every time you make changes, you should validate and add new questions. And the most important questions to add are the ones that don't work yet.